In this video, we'll walk through creating a global nav using Flexbox. So as you can see here, we'll start out with some basic HTML that will define where a logo might go, where some navigation items might go, where a user box, kind of like this one up in the corner, might go, and then finally a logout button so that the user can log out. So this will be an intro to some of the Flexbox concepts, but also an example if you're already familiar with how to use Flexbox. So let's get started. As you can see, I also have just a little bit of boilerplate in CSS, and of note here I'm using SAS or SCSS just to do border box and everything and use a sans serif font. So we'll start out very simply with maybe putting a background color behind this bar so we can see more clearly what's going on. So we'll create a class called gnav or global nav. We'll define a background on it, and we'll make that a fairly dark gray. And we'll go over here and add in that class to our HTML. So you can see where the global nav is occurring. We can see that that's filling this space. Obviously, we don't want these things vertical. We would rather have them horizontal. So that's really where Flexbox comes in. I think first, though, I'm going to make this a little darker. So let's use Flexbox to lay these things out horizontally. So as you can see right now, we have one containing div with a few subdivs in it. So far, since divs are blocks, those will stack vertically by default. But we want them to stack horizontally. So let's go ahead and introduce the first Flexbox property, and that's actually in the display property of display flex. So just by adding this gnav container or gnav containing div will use the flex layout for displaying its child items. Now you're seeing a lot of defaults here for Flexbox, but it's very customizable. So one of the defaults for Flexbox is the direction in which it lays out items. So by default, it will lay out items in a row, but if you'd like for them to lay out in a column, you can do that too. That kind of gets us back to where we started though, so we'll leave the default to being a row. Now another nice thing about Flexbox is aligning things vertically or aligning its children vertically. So let's say, what if this logout item was actually a button? And I'm going to go ahead and make my buttons have a font size of 16 pixels. So you can see here items are laid out at the top of our container here, but that doesn't create a very nice visual. It'd be a lot nicer if all of the items lined up along their baseline or the bottom of a normal letter within the text. So we'll use one of the Flexbox properties called align items. Align items has a couple of different options, and we'll go over a few of them here. The one you're seeing right now is actually called Flex Start. So you can see no changes occurred here. So earlier when we chose our flex direction, by default it's a row, or we can select a column to align them up vertically. We're setting our main axis. Our main axis is a row here. Align items will align things along its cross axis. So our cross axis in this case will be vertical, and the start of that will be at the top. Now maybe we wanted things aligned at the bottom. We could select flex end, so that would align at the end of our cross axis. But what we really want is baseline. So that'll create a nice effect here where the bottom of each letter, whether it's text or a button, will line up with each other. So that's pretty cool. Now your next step, you might be tempted to add some padding within this global nav, but that's not typically what I like to do. For any buttons in the nav, I like for the full height of the navigation to be a clickable area. So instead of adding padding to the container, I really like to add padding instead to the button and let the container stretch out automatically. So let's go in here. Since we're using SAS, we can nest these. So I'll go ahead and just say that a button will have a padding of 15 pixels all the way around. So as you can see, by adding that padding, even though these items don't have padding, they still align up along the baseline of the text with that Flexbox Align Items property. Now a logout button and the user area are typically maybe on the right-hand side of the global nav, so we need some way to create this space in the middle. So I'm going to add a spacer in here. As you can see, all of the items kind of squish up over here to the left-hand side, or to the start of our main axis. So child items in a Flexbox container will only take up as much room as they need. But perhaps the namesake property of Flexbox is the Flex property. And the Flex property will allow you to define how items grow and shrink based on the entire space available in the container. So let's try out just a flex of 1. And we can see here that suddenly all of our items are spaced out. Now this is actually a shorthand property. The flex attribute has 3 values that it accepts. The first one is what ratio the element uses in order to grow. The second one is a ratio that the element uses in order to shrink. And the third one is what's called the flex basis. I kind of think of this as the default width of an element, which that can be auto, it can be in pixels, a few different units. But for now, I'm going to just stick with the shorthand, flex of 1. Now you may be wondering, what is 1? What does that mean? 1 is really a user-defined value. So you might have noticed a second ago I said the word ratio. And so 1 is relative to the other flex values of the other child elements. So the spacer, since we don't have any more flex, since we don't have any more children defining a flex property, 1 is fine. But let's say we wanted the logo to take up, maybe 1 unit of space, and the navigation to take up maybe 2 units of space. Let's actually go ahead and take a look at that and see what that may look like. So I'm going to delete this real fast. So let's add classes to our logo and nav so that we can play around with the flex element and see how it behaves. So let's say our logo has a flex of 1, and that will end up just much like the spacer. And let's put a background on it so we can see what's going on. So logo is red, we have a flex of 1. Let's make the nav a flex of 2 and see how this behaves. And we can add a background color on it as well. So you can see that nav is taking up twice as much room as logo. So their ratios are 1 to 2. It's not an exact pixel value, it's not a percentage, it is a ratio for how it behaves. Or in this case, how much room it takes up in the space available, or how much it grows. So now that we understand a bit more about ratios, we'll go ahead and take these out and add back in our spacer. Now another thing that I like to do is, rather than the items be in the full corner here, I like them to line up with the content. So let's pretend we had some content here, and that content actually had some nice margin and padding around it to give it some space. So we'll define a content class, and we'll go over here and create a content class as well. Now let's say that it has a vertical margin of 45 pixels and a horizontal margin of auto, which will automatically add margin based upon the element's width. So let's go ahead and make a max width of 1200 pixels, And there we go. Now if you can't tell what this is doing, let's add a background on it. So this blue is a maximum of 1200 pixels, and it will automatically add in horizontal margin in order to fill that area. Now maybe we wanted the max width to be 1000 pixels. That may make more sense for a smaller screen here for this example. So I'm just going to add a few other properties in here just to kind of mock up our screen so we can pretend that we have content down here. So back to our global nav, I typically like to have the items line up with the edge of the content so they're not expanding outside of kind of the user's main area of view. So let's do a similar thing up here on our navigation. So we really need a wrapping element that we can put this inside of. So let's take our gnav container and have it constrain itself to the area of this maximum width. We'll do a similar technique as we did below by setting a max width as well as a margin. Now instead of having a magic number here, we'll go ahead and make this a variable since we're using SCSS. So I'll say that this is the content width. And now we can use that in our gnav element. So let's say that this also has a maximum width of the content width. And we can see that take effect. And then also we'll give it a margin of 0 pixels vertically and auto horizontally. So that centers up as well. But we do have a bit of a problem here. As you can see, our gray background isn't extending out to the edge of the screen. So what we'll need to do in this case is create a wrapping element for our global nav. So we'll create another div outside of this one. And I'll call this gnav container. We'll want to move a few things to this container. First, we'll want to move the background, and let's see how far that gets us. Actually, that's exactly what we'll need, so we'll stay there. This is looking much closer to what you might expect out of a global nav. So let's finish things off by adding some more styling to these child elements to make this look a little nicer. First, we'll start off with the logo. So perhaps we'll change its color to make it appear a bit more faint because the navigation items are really what you want the user to focus on. Also, we could use some margin on the right-hand side of that logo. For the navigation, let's add in some nav items so that we can see what might be here. We might have a home. Depending on what application this is, we might have a profile, and then maybe a settings item. I don't know what application this is, but this gives us some examples. Now we have these lovely blue underlined links here, so let's clean that up a bit. So for any link within our navigation, for both its normal state and its visited state, let's make sure that the color is whatever the containing element is using. Let's make sure that it is not underlined. Now this looks pretty good, but they're still pretty close together, so we might need some padding in here too. But I see another issue. So you can see our navigation links aren't taking up the full vertical space. So if a user came up here to click, they might miss clicking on the exact letters itself. We want to give them a very large area to click for each one of these items. So I'm going to go ahead and actually add on a background color to our navigation element here so I can show you something. So you can see we have some blue now in between these navigation links to represent where this nav tag is. There's another option on this align items property called stretch, if you can spell it. With stretch, each item within the Flexbox will stretch to take up the full space along its cross axis. So we can see the nav element, or the blue, is taking up the full vertical space here. But what that's done is, now that each child is taking up the full vertical space, their inner content, or the text, is vertically aligned within each of these divs or nav tags. So we're stuck here with a bit of a problem. We have two approaches we can take. We can either use align item stretch to stretch out each one of these to the full vertical space, or we can use align items baseline and then match the paddings on the various elements in order to take the full vertical space. It's a bit of a toss-up, the approach. I think for right now I'm going to match up the different paddings. So let's take our padding that we have here in the button, and let's call this button padding. And then we can use this to match on the navigation links as well. So now our navigation links are taking up the full vertical space of the nav bar, just like the logout button over here. But as you can see, there's actually a tiny bit of space in between each one. That's actually due to the nature of HTML here. If we eliminated the space between these, you could see that the space between them would be gone. Now this is an annoying way to code and kind of an annoying thing about HTML, but we can fix this as well by, instead of laying these things out normally as A tags are, which is inline, let's lay them out using Flexbox 2. So that has made each one of these 8 tags behave a bit more like a block. And now Flexbox has taken over for the layout and has removed all the space. So we can get rid of these background colors now that we know what's going on. So we're looking better here. We have the logo, we have fully spaced out, but still large clickable area navigation links. So now let's finish up the user and logout section over here. Let's remove some of the default styling on the buttons. Now I would recommend using more of a CSS reset in order to do this, but we'll go ahead and remove it ourselves for now. So we'll set the background to none and the border to none. And we'll make sure that the font color is inherited from the parent. So as you can see, we also have different fonts here, so let's go ahead and make sure that that is inherited as well. With our user, I would like more of a Google style letter with a circle around it. So let's make this a K for Kevin. Give it a class of user. And we'll make this into a circle. Let's say the background will be red. Let's give it a fixed size of, say, 32 pixels. We'll see how that looks. Let's give it a border radius. Let's align its text horizontally center. Now, one trick to vertically aligning this text is to simply apply the Flexbox principles that we've already learned here. So let's make this user icon a Flexbox itself, or a Flex container. And the text inside of it will act as the child elements. Now we can see text align doesn't have much of an effect here, so we'll go ahead and remove that. So we'll add in the align items property, just as we did on the GNav Flexbox to make that center. Now, as you can see, that has vertically centered the text, but what about the horizontal center? Now, let's take a few steps back through this. By making this a Flexbox, we are adhering to the defaults of Flexbox. One of the defaults is the flex direction of row. So if there were more items within this user icon, everything would be lined up in a row. Align items will align things to its cross axis. So the cross axis of the row will be vertically, so that's why it vertically centered the text. And there's a separate property for how to align things along the main axis, and that one is called justify content. And we can also apply a center there. So now we have a centered up K both vertically and horizontally within this user icon. And we can see that because the container of K, which is GNav, has an align items property of baseline, everything is lined up very nicely along the baseline of the text. Now, if you have trouble remembering the difference between align items and justify content, don't worry, I have the same trouble. Just play with it for a while and things will become a bit more natural over time. Well, I think that about wraps it up for today. I hope this provided a good example for you of how to use Flexbox to create a global navigation like this and to create a nice user experience with large clickable areas for each one of these items. Let me know in the comments section if you have any questions or have any other examples that you'd like to see how you can use Flexbox to accomplish. And also subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this. Thanks!